Hello and welcome back to another edition of Cherie and Elizabeth Talk Sports. I am Cherie Louise Turner. I am the host and producer of Strides Forward, a podcast about running, and we feature stories about women. And I am here with Elizabeth Emery, who is the host and producer of Hear Her Sports, which focuses on all things women in sports. How are you doing today, Elizabeth?
I am actually doing really, really well.
Good.
So my news this week is I am no longer running. So
Oh
I
no.
know, and the reason I'm so excited about it actually, which is weird.
Good.
So I think it was on Tuesday or Wednesday, I did a 30-minute walk run, and I had been doing some walk runs, and this was the walk run with sort of more running in it. And I came back and my knee was like this gigantic swollen mess. And I was just like, this is not worth it. I go out and I suffer through 30 minutes of bullshit walk run. And I come back and I'm completely hobbled. And so I was like, this is not worth it. I'm not running anymore. It's time to call it quits, admit defeat. And then the next day, I just felt so much better. I felt so much lighter. And I did a weight training workout and it went really well. And I thought, like this is the opportunity for me to do more yoga, more stretching, more strength training, and use the time that I had been doing these damn 30-minute walk runs for something more productive. And okay, so I can't run. But anyway, it felt like this huge weight was lifted off my shoulder. And I think that it helped having edited this past week the Stacey Sims episode of Hear Her Sports, because she talks a lot about the incredible importance of stretching, the incredible importance of weightlifting. So, of course, that fed into feeling okay about not running anymore. So that's where I am. And it also reminded me, so often as athletes, or I'll talk for myself, I feel like I force things, like I have to run because that's what I do. I love to run. I have to do it. No, like, okay, now it's not running time. It may get
Right.
better. It may not.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really healthy because running when it doesn't feel good is not fun.
It's lame.
It's it sounds like you've been feeling lame. You're not
Exactly. I
wrong.
have been feeling
Yeah.
lame.
Yeah. So, well, of course that makes it makes me sad, but it makes me very happy that you're totally fine with it and there are plenty of other things to do, right? And
Yes.
maybe at some point this will resolve itself, maybe it won't,
Right.
but you have lots of other outlets and that's important.
Exactly.
So,
Oh, and part of that too is I discovered, so it just was this great synchronicity of the Sims deciding not to run, and the Birkenbinder wave placings came out, and I did move up from wave 5 to wave 2 based on my time for this last year. So I'm moving up, way up, so I could have a goal again to really kill it in the next one.
oh, that's super exciting. And if we were to listen to, or sort of be ones to listen to signs from the universe, that sounds like some
Yes,
messages from the universe coming at you, like,
exactly.
"Hey, look over here instead."
Yeah,
Stop beating yourself up.
exactly.
So, oh, that's fantastic. That's
Yeah,
fantastic. Congratulations.
thanks. Yeah, felt good.
So, well, I have kind of opposite news that I'm really loving running.
Yay!
And there's sort of this interesting thing coalescing as we approach Marathon Monday. And I'll let viewers in on a little secret is that we are not recording on a Monday today because I'm going to be running the Boston Marathon. So we have to push it back a few days. Uh, so my little my update it just has to do with the Boston Marathon because I am here in Boston. My office is a block from the finish line. Everything in my life over like the week leading up to Boston is about the Boston Marathon. So I'm really not thinking about much of anything else. Uh, so one so a couple of things that came together. I've been a bit nervous about this Boston Marathon because I've been training for track. So my big focus had been running a half mile up until a month ago. And so I thought, my gosh, like how am I gonna do like trying to get ready for a marathon in 1 month? But I did run, back in October. So I'm sort of relying on that residual endurance and then just my years and years of endurance experience. And I've been feeling great running because I've taken a little bit of downtime, but I've had very targeted workouts. I've done 2 substantial long runs and felt good. And and I took a little break from some weight training, and I've done more yoga. And then I listened to your Stacey Sims episode,
Yay,
and
Stacy.
she emphasized how women, especially our age, are so good at endurance that even training for a marathon, an hour and a half run should be enough, and you should focus more on strength and speed. And I'm like, without knowing, I basically did everything that Stacey Sims
Yep.
recommended. So I have felt great out on my runs the last few days. I do not feel beat up. I feel like I'm moving really well. I feel like my body's super responsive. I've been eating really well too. I mean, I tend to eat quite well anyway, but I tend to be an under fueler, and I've really, really, really focused on not being that. And I just feel like all these things are coming together, and the weather is supposed to be
That's great.
spectacular.
That's great.
Overcast, cool all day. So, yeah, so I'm super excited. And the
I
city
can't
is
wait.
just absolutely alive with people. So, and I genuinely just want to see what the day brings. I'm really going into this just with a ton of curiosity.
Cool.
And
that's sometimes the best.
Big smile.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
cool.
Yeah, so that's my news. So sticking with the theme that I can't stop thinking about, we're going to talk about an episode from my show that just came out.
I love it. I love that episode.
Yeah, from Strides Forward. And of course, we focus on stories about running told by women. And this one is so dear to my heart. I will try not to start tearing up.
Oh, me too.
It is, yeah. So it features Bobby Gibb, who I have dubbed the first woman of the Boston Marathon, because she is indeed the first woman to ever run the Boston Marathon. 6 years before it was legal, before women could actually apply and get a number and run as a official entrant. And it's her story in her own words. It's very lightly narrated, so most of it is just her talking about her life and her experiences with Boston and beyond. And of course, we have our original music and scoring from Cormac O'Regan, who I always like to give a shout out to, because the podcast wouldn't be what it is without him. So I'll just hand it over to you, Elizabeth. I know you had a chance to listen to it, so I'd just love to hear your thoughts.
Well, it was fantastic. It was super fantastic. And, going back to both of our loves of history, this really, hit me a lot. And so I think 2 things. One, I just want to remember her love of life. Like, oh my gosh, if we can take one thing away from that, it just, how joyous she is. It was infectious. So there was that. But then the other thing, and even before I got fully into the episode, so early on, I was really struck by the heartbreak of I'm going to get teary. The heartbreak of keeping women like her from running.
Yeah.
It's just terrible of anything, right? Of anything.
Because it gets me.
Yeah. And to me, that's the biggest problem with all of this sexism and, keeping women from sports is just like, okay, there are plenty of women who don't do sports, but for the women who do sports, I mean, you're truncating them. And I thought that she did an incredible job describing her own feelings of that, but also then later in the episode, the feelings of her mom.
Yeah.
And I totally related to that.
Yeah. And I agree with you. And for anyone who goes and listens to the episode, I do start it out by her talking about how she got her mom to drive her to the start of the Boston Marathon. And it was this breakdown of her mom always trying to get her to follow social norms, because, parents get afraid for their kids when they want to do something different. Right. And so she had this daughter who just was not into abiding by all these very restrictive rules, and it was finally this moment where her mom helps her to do this thing. And so
she cried, it sounded like.
Yeah, I think they both did. And it, oh God, it gives me goosebumps. But it's just this moment of, sort of recognizing the horrible thing it is to hold people back because of the way they look or the body that they're born into. And it is both heartbreaking and then also really wonderful when people are finally allowed to break out of that or force their way out of it, or however that comes about. So
Right.
yeah,
I
yeah,
thought it was pretty phenomenal that she recognized that in her mom. I mean, I don't know if it's, in retrospect or if she knew back then that that was what was going on, because I think a lot of the reason that this is such a problem is that in the moment, it's not always realized that that's what's happening. And so you
right,
have this feeling of boxed in, but like what, you don't really know that that's not normal.
right, right. Yeah, yeah. Well, because it's what you see around you.
Exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, and like she says, lots of women participate in it too, right? Like it's not just guys
Oh,
saying like you
totally.
have to
Oh,
do
yeah.
this. It's like, I mean, these are women who were like going along
Right.
as well. So yeah, yeah. So yeah, I'm very happy with how it turned out. So
Yeah.
now moving on to our media section, we're doing something a little bit different because I wanted to clarify a little bit more why we are doing these videos at all and why we say we're focusing on media when in many cases we're not focusing specifically on media, when we focus on the science around studying athletes and why or why not it's focused on women athletes and why it's important to focus on women athletes, or why do we talk about reds when really we're talking about like supposedly talking about sports media. And Elizabeth, you bring up many times the sort of intricate web of all of this, and so I just wanted to point out first of all that it is an intricate web when it comes to media and what they cover. And there's so many things that feed into whether or not something gets coverage, and the fact that it does or doesn't get coverage then also kind of spiders out into lots of other things as
Right.
well. So there are many reasons why we talk about lots of other subjects under the umbrella of sports media. And so I wanted both of us to bring up some of the things that we think are important under this umbrella and how they sort of connect to sports media, just to kind of go back and clarify our thinking for viewers and maybe help give a bigger picture of why it is so important that sports media has more equity.
Right.
So I'll let you kick it off, Elizabeth.
Okay. So I have a bunch of ports, but I think just since we're interested in the web aspect of it, I'm going to talk about the quality of media coverage. And I've been
Uh-huh.
thinking a lot about that because I've been watching a lot of cycling, and they've been doing a good job of covering more women's events, in correspondence with the men's events. And that's in part because there are now, for example, we're in the classics, the bike racing classics,
Right.
which are 1 day events.
Spring.
And so in the past several years, more and more of the classics, which have been traditionally men, are now having a women's race. So the coverage can show both. But one of the things that Cheryl Cookie points out is about the quality of the coverage. And this was also something that came up when I first started, I don't know, noticing the lack of media coverage for women. And this was before I started the podcast, Hear Her Sports. And even my friends and family were saying, it's not as good coverage, and, we don't like it. It's not as exciting. And so just to talk a little bit more about that, is oftentimes the women's events, they have second tier commentators, or they have, that's the where new commentators start, to move up the ladder to get to the top event, the men's event. And as Cheryl Cookie points out, we love pointing out Cheryl Cookie, is she talks about how oftentimes the commentators don't have this excited, they don't use exciting words, they don't, they aren't excited about the sport. And part of this, I think, is, the lack of experience, the lack of knowledge. I think oftentimes commentators don't actually know about the women's events, because if
Right.
they're only getting 4% media coverage, how are they going to find out about it? Like it's
Right.
this sort of, like snowball effect. But then I also, relating to how this media coverage relates to other things, it's possible that the quality is not, in fact, as good as the men's. And I think we have to acknowledge that, because, and so why is that true? And, the women aren't getting as paid as much.
Right.
So it means perhaps that they have a second job. So they're not able to train as much, or maybe they're not able to sleep as much, or maybe they can't afford coaches, or they can't afford nutrition, or they can't afford training tools, or all this stuff that they might, or body work or massage, like all this stuff, or even doctors or nutrition. There's all this stuff that lack of salary may impact. And then, of course, the teams often don't have the same amount of money. So what does that mean? That means they don't have the same coaches. They don't have the same staff. They don't have the same, nutritionists, or the same doctors, or the same access to testing of the athletes or testing of the equipment. I mean, again, it's this cascading effect. And I'm a cyclist, so I think a lot about this. And one of the things that's starting to happen now is this greater discussion of, should women's cycling have the grand tours? And the grand tours in cycling are 3 weeks long, like the Tour de France, huge, huge events. So should women have that? And, like my instant reaction, yes, of course they should have it. But what does that mean? That means that teams have to be bigger. They have to be more funded. It means that the athletes have to have time to train for those kind of events. Most women athletes don't train that, because until very recently, there were all these things that prevented them from doing that, from the salaries, from, the amount of training time they had because they had other jobs. I mean, it's just, again, this goes back to the tangled web.
Right.
And the reason it goes back to media is because one of the reasons that there's not enough money for the women athletes and the women's teams is because there's not enough media coverage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah. And it goes back and forth too,
Sure.
Right? Because where the money goes and where all the pizzazz goes, or what have you, I mean, that's where the media is going to follow too. So so it is very much this back and forth. And to your point, like, of the quality not being there, that has been the case in the past. And it's just sort of like, oh, but women don't, perform, or there isn't the depth of field. And that's oftentimes the case. Is like, maybe there are a couple superstars, but there just isn't the depth of field. So it's not that exciting.
Right.
And it takes a long time to build these things. And what ends up happening is that everything gets compared to what the men have been doing. And the men have been doing it sometimes for like literally 100 years longer.
Right. But I do want to point out, like, yes, it takes a long time, but often it takes like one change to have huge impact. So recent, again, in cycling, and I talk about cycling just because I follow it, I know it. So in cycling, one of the things that happened, in addition to raising salaries, riders are now getting contracts that are longer than 1 year. So that seems very simple, but the web cascading impact of that is that riders who are support riders, so not the superstars, but the team helper riders, are no longer feeling like they have to get a result so that they get a contract for another year. And what that means is they can support their rider. And that means that the racing is more exciting. And it means that there's more solidity. It means that there's more team unity, because all these riders aren't being selfish because they have to. If they aren't selfish, they have no job the following year.
Right.
And the result of that is there has been there's been more team supporters in the racing, and the racing, I guess my point is that it has made a huge impact, just this one change.
Right. Extending contracts.
Yeah.
And it makes sense. Right.
It does, but I don't know if I would have thought that. I don't know if I would have,
put all the dots together.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I'm going to change gears just a little bit and focus on another, just like one more aspect of something that we like to talk about a lot, and that is RED-S, which is relative energy deficiency in sport. And I'm also going to group this in together with body image. And they're different, but they're very overlapping. And so what does that have to do with media? It has a lot to do with media, because media shows us photos of what athletes look like. They talk about women's bodies, and they give us, the greater public, the impression of what it is to be one of these athletes. And when you only have men telling these stories, and they have historically, and it's not nearly as bad today, they've historically sexualized women in sports. They take photos differently, and we talk about all these things, and that then can help contribute to things like, poor eating habits, and even just uh, the way that we talk about what athletes have to do, and just sort of the impression of what it is to be a woman athlete, when that is all coming from a male system. It isn't helping women. And it's just like, I see these things all sort of feeding on each other, because we have these images of what we're supposed to look like to fall into this category. And commentators very much will say, like, oh, she doesn't look like a marathon runner because she's very big.
Right.
And things of this nature, where I would wonder if, like, there was a woman who'd been in the sport who would never say something like that about another woman, or even just somebody who knows the sport better, um, would maybe not talk about it in the same sort of way. So I think, media does shape what we think athletes should look like. And it also shapes, kind of the whole story of being an athlete. And that is and that very much feeds into body image, and the body image thing feeds into how we deal with nutrition. And, diet culture for women is a very big deal. And, yeah. So do you want to comment on that a
I
little
do.
bit,
Like
Elizabeth?
I have so many things floating around in my
I know.
head.
That's what me too.
But one of the things that, and it still blows me away, and I think I've talked about this in a previous video, is my friend who's the same age as I am, and she is a Black woman, and she's tall, and she and I both had the same image of what a female athlete looks like. And that was blonde haired, blue eyed, tall, and very thin.
Right.
And that just blows me away, because that clearly is not coming from either of us. We
Right.
have been fed that information. And
And
I mean,
from where?
I know,
The
yeah,
media.
the media.
Yeah.
And I know that I don't know about her, but for me, I know that I often felt like I was not an athlete. I was not thin enough, I was not tall enough. And we've talked about how I love finding short athletes, and it's all because of that. And it does such a disservice. Again, I go back to, we're preventing women from doing something that they could be good at or could gain a lot from. And again, I have heartbreak for that.
Yeah. And it, like, I look at sports for women as being so much more than entering a race or playing a game or being
Sure.
part of a team. I mean, it is hugely linked to self-confidence. It is hugely linked to leadership skills. It and something that I think about all the time is, it is also linked to, my body is about something other than what somebody sees when they look at it. And
Yeah.
I think that is so critical. And so the other thing about media is, media tells us what to value and how to value it.
Right.
And I think it's really important to remember that media is very much shaped by dollars and who's in charge,
Yeah.
and what they value and where the money's coming from. And so, linking this back to our women in sports situation, when you do not have, when there's not a lot of fanfare and money around something, it's going to get less attention from the media. And if it isn't of interest to the people in charge, it's not going to get a lot of coverage.
Right.
So yeah, just this intertangled web is very interesting. And that's why, we also talk about why it's important to have women behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And most importantly in that is in power positions, because that's when you get to really exercise your voice. If you have a young upstart journalist, but the whole hierarchy above them is a bunch of men who want to keep the system the same way it is, let's see what stories get passed through the editorial
Right.
system.
Of course.
And it's not going to be probably what she really wants to
Right.
say.
Right.
And that happens with, cultural differences, and,
Sure.
lots of, it's not just men versus women, of course, but in our, in our landscape, that's what we talk about.
Right.
So.
Do you remember when you understood that your body was for function?
No, I I don't have like a poignant moment, but it has been hitting me more as I get older, and it
That's interesting.
sinks in more and more. Um, yeah, yeah. And yeah, and I've really grappled with body image over
Mm,
time. And I was a chronic dieter when I was an athlete. It was the worst. I had very borderline eating disorder situations going
right.
on. And probably not even borderline. I mean,
Right.
so yeah, I had a very horrible relationship with food up until really quite recently, I would say. You know, here I'm at
Yeah.
52 and learning how to eat properly when I'm like 49 years
Yeah.
old.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't blame all of it on media, but I surely see how it has a big impact, whether we realize it consciously or not. I think there is this understanding that what the media covers is what's important. And as I've learned over the years, and I've been in journalism and I've worked in magazines, and you see like how things get made, and it isn't quite as egalitarian as all that,
Right.
you know. So yeah, I mean, there's a reason why there are a bazillion stories about dudes throwing baseballs, and there's like a woman who runs a world record in 24 hours at 40 years old, and she gets some media coverage, but not much. And
Yeah.
you will never convince me that what she did is any less deserving of an enormous amount of fanfare as professional baseball players. Like, and that's where the breakdown really is like somehow these feats are not as important. And I just had this conversation with Devin Yanko the other
Mm,
day. And I said, you know, Devin, I said, it really hit me that the only reason why you aren't going to be, you know, news on the wire tomorrow is because you don't play tennis,
right. Right.
right? Like you're not at the set, you know, like you are not in a sport that gets attention, but it doesn't make what you did any less deserving of that attention. So yeah, so
I,
that gets me
yeah.
pissed off too.
I would like to, I think you and I need to figure out a way to look more into, like why did we end up with the sports being football, basketball, and baseball? Like why are those the main sports? I mean, how did that start? And, certainly in other countries, I mean, biathlon is huge over in the
Right.
Nordic countries. I mean, we don't
Yeah.
have the same amount of snow here, of course, but I mean, that's so interesting just to think about that.
Right. And how those came out. Well, years of a machine behind them,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, the all those football players and baseball players, like there's all the stories about how those people did not make money for a long time.
Right.
So yeah, and you know, cricket and soccer, aka football, like is so popular the world around, you know, and like how
Yeah.
did that all come about? But um yeah, yeah. So I think the only other thing I really wanted to touch on too, and I kind of touched on this a little bit, just in terms of, you know, sort of wandering off from the very specific aspect of like what we actually see in the media, is also just that behind the scenes look.
Mm,
um I I do think a lot about like who shapes the narrative, and also going back to like you just saying, like us focusing on sports that don't get a lot of media attention. I mean, I think part of that in our cases is that we both came from bike racing backgrounds, and in the United States bike racing is just not that
right.
popular, and it's sort of, and I, you know, now I've fallen into the running world, which you would think would be quite popular, because bazillions of people run, but the media can't quite get it together
Hmm.
to really cover on a really regular basis the running world. I don't understand that at all because it's
Right.
something that so many people can relate to. Um, but a lot of it is, I believe, who is shaping the narrative. And if you have people who have grown up, and most of them being men, like watching football with their dad
Yeah.
their whole life, and they have a love of it, and when they think sports journalism, I mean, I thought about this. I had a person I was working with in podcasting recently, and he had started out and he said, I was a sports journalist. And I said, I'll bet you, I said, I was a sports journalist too, but I bet you 100% that you and I do not have the same definition of what it means to be a sports journalist,
Right.
because you only write about baseball.
Hmm.
And I pretty much was only writing about bike racing when I, you know, first started out. And it does make me think about the fact, even in my own life, why don't I feel the need to demand more of covering these sports that we hold so dear? Right. And I do. And even just realizing, well, it is like who shapes the narrative of what's important to talk about. We just have a lot of people in power who think that it's most important to talk about hockey, baseball, basketball, and football.
Right.
And they have built their entire readership around that.
I was just going to say, I mean, it's sort of
Yeah.
hard, like I think about the New York Times and they rarely cover anything but, the major sports, which always seems so strange to me. And, what would it take for them to sort of turn that around and start covering more running, which they're doing a little bit, but start covering more of all these other sports? And it could be a huge ask because their readership, maybe is in fact not interested.
Well, and you hear again and again that the readership gets really pissed off when they don't get what they want.
Yeah.
And I always do have a hesitation of categorizing who those people are, but they are by and large white men, and
But you
they're
know what? Okay, so
mean. They
but
really are.
this is so interesting because I would bet that overall New York Times readership is close to 50-50 male female. And I would also bet
I'd buy into that.
Right. So I would also bet that the people who are reading the sports section, and I'm just basing it on my scientific study of one
hunch.
again.
Yeah,
right.
My
hunch is that the people who read the sports section are not women who have made a conscious decision like, oh, this section is not for me. And so, and this goes back to another point I was going to make is, one of the arguments I heard before I started to hear her sports is that, no one watches women's sports, or women don't watch women's sports, or women were not interested in women's sports. But again, we go back to our love, Cheryl Cookie and her vending machine.
Yes.
If you don't offer me something,
right,
I'm not going to, why would I read the New York Times sports section most of the time? There's just so little in there for me. And, I do look because sports is sort of my area, but if you're, I can see not even opening the section.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I've done the same thing. I'll pop in there every once in a while, get really pissed off, right. And go look elsewhere.
Right. But this goes into this tangled web again, because, okay, what would it take for the New York Times to make a more egalitarian sports section? I don't know. It would be a big ask. But meanwhile, that leaves you and me and the people like me having to find sports coverage somewhere else. And it's not often available, or it's not often available for free, or it takes a ton of research, and who the hell has time for that?
Right, right. Yeah, it's hard to find.
Yeah.
And then you have to subscribe to 10 different things to get what you're looking at. And in the running world, you have to, if you want to follow televised running races,
yeah,
good luck. Good luck.
It doesn't, as we say that, doesn't that just seem insane?
Yeah. It seems like a lot of lost opportunity is what I often
true
think
that.
about.
Yeah. Yeah.
And heavy lifting. Look, I don't blame, well, I sort of blame the New York Times, but let's say for a moment, I don't blame them for making the readership that they've built happy, but they aren't doing their job. That's the other thing, right? It's just okay, well, I understand you're a business and you have people who, you've built this audience and you want to make them happy. But you aren't doing your job.
Right.
You're not doing what you say you do. And then you put the best running articles, at least some of the most influential and important running articles, in your opinion section, which I think is totally BS. I think they should be in the sports section. And I think that whatever change needs to be made to make those sports section worthy and not opinion page worthy, because there are different standards that they use. Mm-hmm. So whatever that is, that's what they should be doing. Because those are sports stories.
Right.
And relegating, and they're all they're very important women's sports stories, and they're in the opinion section. And I find that to be insulting. So
probably comes from the top. Probably comes.
Yeah,
from
exactly. And and a lot of it is Lindsay Krause's work, and she does a phenomenal job. So I do not by no means do I think that those articles aren't important, but it makes me frustrated.
It makes me frustrated too. And my guess is that she is getting incredible support from the opinion people at the top, and she is not getting the same support from the sports people at the top.
Yeah, and I don't know how they divide their people and those sorts of things. So it's immaterial at this point because somebody at the top knows exactly what's going on. and
Oh yeah,
how
and they
that's right.
definitely know. I mean,
Yeah.
the article that we talked about with Jesse Diggins being called a sprite, they
Jeez.
got a lot of comments. They
And
know.
they
They
didn't care.
Oh, they didn't care. Yeah, they
It
don't care.
was it's so ugly.
Yeah.
Anyway, I feel like we could rant about this
We
all
could.
day,
I'm
Elizabeth,
looking
but
at
I
the
think
time and we could go on and on.
right. So, but I think we've made our point that like media coverage is so critical to a much bigger picture of how women athletes see themselves, what we think is available to us. Where does the money in science in research go to support athletes? And all of these things are interconnected. And the media is the big front facing part of all of this. So
Yeah.
have a lot of power uh, they have a lot of power in many ways, and these things play off of each other. Like where the money goes, the media goes, where the media goes, the money goes, and so they're all very interrelated. So I guess it's just a note to viewers that you can see us bring in, many different aspects of this because it all is the part of this tangled web.
Yeah. And we love
So
it.
yeah. Do you want? Is there anything else you want to add there, Elizabeth?
No, like as I said, we could go on and on. So it's
That's
probably
what
time to
next week is
stop.
for.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to sign off for the two of us. And I am Cherie Louise Turner of Strides Forward. And I am here with Elizabeth Emery of Hear Her Sports. And thanks for watching. See
Thank
you
you.
next week.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.